Hey everyone, I'm Steve. This is the American Garage.
On this episode of The American Garage, Steve moves along in the restoration process, preparing parts for paint. All of this coming up on The American Garage.
Now, as you can see, this piece is ready to go. In the process of doing this, I got my hands all dirty. And plus, I'm putting all my fingerprints and the oils from my hands on the part as well. So, in order for the paint to stick, even though we're just going to be using primer, we want to make sure that this is as clean as it can be. So the first thing I'm going to do is go wash my hands, get them clean, and then I'm going to wash the part with isopropyl alcohol. Alright, so I went and washed my hands. I went ahead and put on some surgical gloves. Now this is for twofold purpose. One is I don't want paint on my hands, and two, now that my hands are clean, there's still going to be oil coming from my hands, and if I handle the part now, it's going to put more oil from my hands on the part. So it protects my hands from paint, it protects the part from my hand oil. So let's take some regular isopropyl alcohol. This is 99% isopropyl alcohol. You can get it at your grocery store or pharmacy. And you take this with your with a paper towel and soak the paper towel real well. And just wipe the entire piece. Isopropyl alcohol is going to dry very fast. And notice that we're getting some dirt off that we didn't know about. That dirt would have caused the paint to not adhere as well as it could have. So we want to make sure we get as much of that off as we possibly can. And now my part is ready for paint. I'm using this box because it's a nice white surface, so you'll be able to see real well what's happening. Now I'm going to show you some techniques of how to use your spray paint. Now the first thing is when you get a can of paint, it's going to have a little ball inside, so you want to shake it for at least a minute or so you hear that ball rattling around real good. That mixes the paint inside the can. Now, most people make the mistake of just trying to, and I'm going to cover this area up here, just trying to just spray around it like that. Okay? Now that may seem like a good idea, but we have got these runs right here. Now another mistake people make is they hold it in one place too long. And watch what happens. Now look at how all the paint is running. That's going to give us a terrible paint job. Now this is because of two reasons. One, I held it in one place for a long time, and two, I was 3 inches away. So we're too close to the piece. Now what you want to do is you want to brush the paint on with the spray can. And you want to start the paint before, here I'm going to turn it this way. Start the paint before the object and go past the other side and then stop. Okay? This also applies to a technique of applying fertilizer to your lawn. If you don't close it off when you get to the end, you're going to have burn spots at the end. If we continue to spray and just go back and forth, we're going to have runs on the ends. Okay? So here's what we're going to do. I'm going to show you without pushing it down. I'm going to push down and start moving and then go to the end and let it loose. Now what that's going to do is my hand is going to be in motion the whole time I'm holding the button down. You don't want to push the button down and then start, because then you're going to get a run like we had down here. Okay, so let's try it. Let's start before our piece, start moving, and I have a real nice stripe. Now if I come back a couple more times, and you can see how I have a real nice coat and there are no runs. Also, don't try to paint as thick as you can to cover up the piece with paint on the first time. Brush it or spray it on lightly first. Do you notice how it doesn't cover everything right there? Now if I let that dry and come back and do it again, and slowly over time build up my paint, I'm going to get a nice, thick, glossy, hard surface. But you have to let it dry between coats. Now most paints are quick dry. If you're using a quick dry paint, you can let it sit for 5 minutes and come back and coat it again. Alright, let's put some paint on our new piece. Now we'll let it dry for a little bit and come back and put another coat on. Alright, our first piece is finished. Let's let it dry and we'll be ready to do the same thing with all the other pieces. Okay, so now we've got one coat of paint on everything, one coat of primer. So we need to put a second coat of primer on everything, but before we do, between coats of paint, we always need to sand. And what I'm going to show you right now is the process of wet sanding. Wet sanding is using water with a sandpaper that's made for wet or dry, so that you can use it wet. And this process will help us to make a nice, smooth finish for the second coat. I've got a bucket of water that's going to be used for the wet sanding, a rag. We've got, of course, got our sanding block. I'm going to go ahead and stick that in the water. And some of our sandpapers. Now we've already used some of these, but they're not used up, so we'll just stick those in the water and get them wet. Let's get started on the wet sanding process. Alright, first of all, I'm going to start off with this little piece right here, and this happens to be part of the air intake on the engine. Okay. I'm just going to take a piece of 220 grit sandpaper, wet or dry, and I'm going to take my rag. Now the thing I'm going to use the rag for is just to keep water on the object. Okay, that's its only purpose. And then I'm just going to lightly sand. Now, as we're sanding, one of the things I want you to do when you do when you do paint something with primer, you're going to notice that the surface is a little bit rough and it's flat. So we don't want to sand the primer off. We just want to make it smooth. So what we're going to do is we're going to just sand very lightly. And the nice thing about wet sanding is there are no particles flying through the air, no little pieces of dust from the sanding, because it's wet. And so the water holds all the particles. So you can do this all day long with people around you that are asthmatic or whatever, and it won't hurt them at all, because all the particles are captured by the water. The water also acts as a lubricant. And it makes the sandpaper work more effectively and more smoothly. Remember, our goal is not to sand through the paint, just to sand it smooth. So I'm going to sand it pretty evenly all the way over, and now I'm going to feel it. Now it still feels a little bit rough. So I'm going to keep going with my sandpaper, use my rag to wipe it all down. And that's feeling much smoother. So we go through the process like this, and let's sand all the pieces we have. We'll wet sand today, and after we're through wet sanding, we'll put some paint, a second coat of paint on these objects. I'm using a towel to dry off my pieces because there are some areas of bare metal that are exposed. So we want to minimize the oxidation, so we'll get the water off there as quick as we can. Let's not forget our isopropyl alcohol in the process of cleaning our parts before we paint. Okay, now we've got our parts ready for paint. Now, since I'm painting a lot, I'm going to use my respirator. Okay, so we have all our parts painted. Let's see what we've got. Okay, now as you can see, we have all the parts primed and ready for paint. Let's get on to the next phase.
Next time on The American Garage, Steve gets a little help from Andrea, friend of The American Garage, and tackles rebuilding the engine on the David Bradley. All of this and more to come on The American Garage.